Chapter 3. 48 hours before being taken to the quarantine location, Dr. Zhang started his shift at 7 in the morning by visiting a few patients hospitalized in the ward. They were all in stable condition, and none of them had complications. Dr. Zhang prescribed their medications and went back to his office to write the patients' reports. While he was finishing his reports, his pager went off. It was an emergency. He immediately threw on his gown, mask, and face shield and went to the ward. 3 nurses were gathering around a middle-aged man who was burning up with a high fever. He was complaining of shortness of breath. "What's the problem?" Dr. Zhang asked. It wasn't apparent if he was asking the man or the nurses. The man replied first. "It started yesterday at noon. I came home exhausted and felt ill. I thought it might be lack of sleep from the previous night, so I went right to bed. Then woke up at midnight with a high fever and a pain in my chest." The man made a whistling sound every time he inhaled. After each sentence, he had to stop and gasp for air before continuing the sentence. "When it didn't get better, I called an ambulance. I thought I might pass out at any moment." Dr. Zhang used his stethoscope to listen to the man's breathing. It wasn't normal. He could hear the high-pitched sound of wheezing while the man took a breath. He prescribed anti-fever medication and asked the nurses to give him an oxygen mask to facilitate breathing. Could it be that he was infected with the novel virus? Does he have the same disease that spread all around the country half a year ago? Wondered Dr. Zhang. The man showed very similar symptoms, except his condition was getting much worse, much faster. He had already developed symptoms that patients usually showed in 2 weeks. He was definitely in critical condition. The images they took of his lungs showed a large amount of liquid in them. That explained why he had difficulty breathing. After that, everything happened so fast. Within 2 hours, his skin turned blue. It was clear he had an oxygen deficiency. Dr. Zhang decided to put the air tubing directly into his lungs, but even this didn't improve his situation. His lungs were so damaged that, even with tubing, he could not get enough oxygen into his blood. The man was in the hospital for almost 5 hours. He died while he was connected to the life support system. Dr. Zhang was at his bedside when he took his last breath. The man's eyes were wide open, and his gaze was fixed to the ceiling as if he, himself, was astonished by how fast everything happened, from a vague feeling of exhaustion to lying lifeless in the hospital bed in a day. The result of his test for the new virus was negative. Although his symptoms were similar, the second test confirmed that he didn't have the known virus in his blood. This confused Dr. Zhang. The man showed all the symptoms, just in a shorter period of time. He sent the man's blood sample to the central laboratory to be checked more thoroughly for other kinds of viruses and finished his report on the deceased man's case. At the end of the report, he wrote, more tests were required from the central laboratory to define the origin of the disease with certainty. It was midnight when Dr. Zhang got home. The house was dark and quiet. Like always, whenever he had long shifts in the hospital, he couldn't see his daughter before she went to bed. Luckily, this was only happening 2 times a week. He took off his shoes and went in. A gleam of light was coming from the bedroom. His wife was probably reading a book, staying up until he got back. He went into the bedroom. The bedside lamp was on. His wife was lying on the bed with a book in her hand. Dr. Zhang came closer. She did not move. Her eyes were closed. Apparently, she fell asleep reading the book. While Dr. Zhang was trying to take the book out of her hand, she opened her eyes. "Sleep, sleep. I'm coming to bed in a few minutes," he whispered quickly in her ear. "How are you, my dear? Have you had dinner? If not, we have food in the fridge." "Yes, I had something in the hospital. Go to sleep. I'll be right there." A few minutes later, he gently crawled under the blanket, laid beside his wife, and smelled the pleasant scent of her hair. She opened her eyes and hugged him. "How was your day, my dear?" she asked quietly. "Well, strange. We had a patient today with all the symptoms of the new virus, but his blood test was negative. He developed the symptoms very quickly, and before we could help him, he died. Still, we don't know what the main reason for his death was. We have to follow it up tomorrow. Other than that, the normal routine. How about you?" "Well, I'm fine. Your daughter, on the other hand, was out of control today. She tried out her new bicycle at the park. She was so excited that she didn't want to come back home. And, of course, whenever she wasn't biking, she was talking all the time." I don't know how many questions she asked me today. Dr. Zhang smiled. So she's fine, but her mother's not. He kissed his wife's forehead. Yeah, I have to admit, it's difficult to run after her on that bike for hours on end. But it's fine because her father's here, and tomorrow at breakfast, he will tell her not to make me so exhausted with her new bike. I'll talk to her. Even better, tomorrow I'll have to be in the hospital around noon, so I can take her to the park in the morning, and you can have some rest. He hugged his wife tightly. I like that plan, she said, and moved into the doctor's arms. Good night, my dear. Good night. Dr. Zhang looked at his wife. He was fortunate to have her and their daughter. Recently, he had a peculiar feeling of contentment that he had rarely felt before in his life. During his 20s and 30s, he was stressed and busy with his education and then later finding a stable career. To get to the position that he had now, he and his wife had moved 3 times from one city to another to gather all the expertise and experiences that he had needed. But finally, all of his efforts resulted in the highest position he could think of, an infectious disease specialist in a big hospital in the capital. He would have never thought when he was growing up that he'd become so successful. His private life had also greatly improved since the first few years of their marriage. He would never forget those initial rocky years when they were having trouble getting pregnant. For years, he and his wife tried different treatments with no results. He remembered the nights when his wife cried in bed, hugging her childhood doll until she fell asleep. His own condition was not much better. He'd never felt so useless and frustrated. It seemed like there was nothing he could do to help his wife. There were times he wasn't sure if their marriage would survive. But finally, 5 years ago, after so many years of waiting, they welcomed their daughter into the world. Now, Dr. Zhang had achieved most of the things he had been waiting and trying so hard for in his life. Sometimes, in moments like this, when all the noises in the world were quiet, he liked to remind himself how life had eventually shown its kind face to him. He hugged his wife tighter and closed his eyes. 48 hours before leaving the hospital for quarantine, Finn was having her breakfast in her apartment close to the hospital. It was her day off. In the hospital, they could choose to have longer shifts and instead get a day off. Most of her colleagues with kids and family didn't like the long shifts. They needed to be at home every day at a specific time to take care of their children. But for Finn, it was the best option. She was young enough to be able to do the long shifts, and on her off days, she was free to pursue her hobbies. That day after breakfast, Finn was going to buy a new set of paints, paper, and frames for her new painting project. After lunch, she was going to the swimming pool, and in the evening, she was meeting her friends for dinner. Finn loved her lifestyle. 10 years ago, she moved from her small hometown to Beijing to gain the independence and freedom she had now. In her hometown, the only way she could blend in was to get married after college and have a kid or two by the age of 30. A big city like Beijing would work as cover for her. Here, she knew nobody from her past. Nobody would pay attention to how she was living. There were no comments on marriage, children, or her age. No judgment about her ambitions and plans for the future, at least not from people that she knew in the city. They were either lone wolves like Finn or too busy with their own lives to meddle in hers. Finn began planning her day in her mind when her phone rang. It was her mom. She called Finn at least every other day, and when she didn't, she expected Finn to call her. Every time Finn forgot or was too busy to call her mom, she had to spend half an hour on the next call explaining herself and apologizing. Naturally, Finn would rarely let her mom's calls go unanswered. It was much easier to talk to her for 5 or 10 minutes than to explain it later. She took the call. "Hi, Mom, how are you?" "Hello, Finn, I'm fine. I was waiting for your call yesterday." Finn rolled her eyes. She decided to pretend she didn't notice her mom's unkind comment. "I was busy in the hospital and later at home." "Busy? You're single, no husband, no kid, no commitment. How can you be so busy to forget to call me?" "Mom, please, don't start again. I'm sorry, I just forgot. How's Dad?" "You know your dad better than I do. He complains about everything, every day." Finn knew her dad well. Yes, sometimes he could be difficult to deal with. He was 20 years older than her mom, and as he grew older, he became more impatient with everything. Her mom did not have any other option but to take care of him. Their generation was very different from Finn's. Her mom never had a real choice in her life. She got married very early, and for as long as Finn could remember, she took care of Finn and her siblings. And now that her children had left the house, she was alone with their old father. So Finn couldn't blame her too much whenever she had a sharp comment for her. In a way, Finn believed her mom envied her life. Maybe deep inside her, her mom wondered how life would be without thinking about and taking care of other people all the time. What did he do this time? What's his newest complaint about? About you. He complains every day that you live so far away, in a big city, alone. Why are you not settling down, getting married, and having kids? He thinks you'll regret it when you get older. I don't know. Why don't you talk to him and explain it to him yourself? I'm tired of justifying your decisions to him. Mom, I'm perfectly happy this way. I don't know why he never thinks that I'm as happy as I could be. I have my job, my hobbies, and my friends. I don't need anything else right now. Tonight, I'm going to dinner with friends at a fancy restaurant. Believe me, I'm living a much more interesting life than you could imagine. Don't worry about me. And who are these friends? Is there a single young man among them? Yes, but we're only friends and nothing more. Please don't start with how I have to convince anyone I meet for the first time to marry me. Okay, as you wish. I'm not going to talk to you about it anymore. Although, for once, I agree with your dad. You will regret it when you get older. Friends stay friends only for a few years. Soon, all of them will have their own families and become so busy they forget about you. Then you'll feel lonely. Anyway, call your dad whenever you have time to talk to him. Okay, Mom, I will. I have to head out now. I'll call him later. Take care. Take care and come home early. Don't stay outside too long at night. It's not safe. Okay, I will. Bye. Bye. Finn hung up the phone. No matter how old she was, her mom always had some warnings for her. Finn loved her mom, but recently talking to her mom and dad was getting more and more exhausting. She wished they would leave her alone and call her only when they genuinely wanted to know how she was, rather than sharing their concerns with her. Finn finished her breakfast and got ready. She had a lot to do that day. Chen was in the middle of his practice session 24 hours before Chen was pushed into the van by the soldier to be taken into the quarantine. Since he was chosen for the national team 3 months ago, he had practice sessions almost every day. The World Championship was in a few months, and they were at the peak of the training. Just a few months ago, becoming a national team member was just a dream for Chen, but now his goal had changed. Now his only goal was to win the gold medal at the World Championship. This was the chance for him to prove to himself and everyone else that he deserved to be the youngest player on the national team. Chen could barely remember a time in his life when he wasn't involved in ping pong. He was 6 years old the first time he touched a ping pong racket. He was in his first year of elementary school. They had a physical training lesson. While everyone else was caught up in the team sports, he found the most joy playing ping pong. The ball's continuous movement, the sound of hitting the table, and the style of his teacher when he was playing, everything about the sport caught Chen's attention. He started practicing not only the physical lessons, but outside of school too. He would stay after school to use the table and the rackets. When his parents learned about his enthusiasm for ping pong, they put him in a local club so he could get serious training every day after school for 2 hours. He was almost 10 when he was chosen for their province's team. From that time until now, at the age of 19, there was no time in his life when he was not training for a competition. That day during the training session, Chen was trying to get used to the method of the new national team coach. Every day, the session started with multi-ball practice. During the practice, another team member drilled bucket after bucket of balls towards him, and he had to respond to them. They always started easy and slow, but as the training session went on, they started hitting the ball faster and with spins and tricks. The multi-ball training could go on for an hour or two continuously. By the middle of the session, Chen's mind was responding automatically to the balls thrown at him. The only way he could take so much pressure was to stay focused on each ball as it was coming towards him. Don't think about the one before or the one after. Take them one by one. Chen could hear his team members shouting something, but he couldn't understand it. The next ball was about to come, and this was the only thing that he could focus on. Whenever he started getting exhausted in the training session, his mind would shut down every other stimulus to him. Everything except the ball coming toward him was a blur to him. He could barely see or hear anything else. Another drive, another smash, another flip. There was always another ball that was coming towards him. Suddenly, Chen heard a faint scream. People always scream during training. Focus on the table, he thought to himself, but no balls were coming toward him. He looked around and saw his team member squeezing one of his hands into the other, bent over from the pain. Chen ran toward him. What happened? The guy could barely talk. It hurts. It hurts. Chen looked at his hand. It was red and swelling. No one in the sports hall could help them. Let me grab the numbing spray. Chen sprayed his hand, but there was no sign of relief on his face. Come on, we have to go to the hospital. This seems like a serious injury. Chen took him to his car, and in less than half an hour, they were in the closest hospital somewhere in a suburb of Beijing. 24 hours before, Lynn would have never believed that in less than a day she would be taken to the quarantine for an unspecified amount of time. She was in school and still had biology and chemistry lessons before she could go home. Lynn was in her last year of high school. In the Chinese education system, that was the most important year of high school. Any student who wanted to be enrolled in a university anywhere in the country had to take the entrance exam at the end of high school. Based on their scores, they were selected for the universities. For many of the students coming from the working class, admission to high-ranking universities was the only way that they could distinguish themselves from the rest of their family and have a chance to improve their social status. Therefore, for most of the students, the last year of high school was all about studying for the entrance exam. However, for Lynn, the university entrance exam was only one of the options. Her father was a successful businessman that had several companies all over the world. Lynn never felt she had to spend all of her time in her last year studying. If she couldn't get admission into the university that she wanted to attend in the country, she could easily move to another country and study at one of the best universities abroad. Out of the whole school, only she and maybe a few others weren't caught up in the frenzy of studying. In fact, long before, when she was in primary school, her mom had prepared her to go abroad for school by sending her to private English lessons. Recently, her mom had hired a young native speaker to practice the language with her and familiarize her with the life of the students in the Ivy League universities in the U.S. Her dad didn't know about it. For as long as she could remember, her mom and dad had completely different views on how they should raise her. Her dad was strict and, in general, against giving her any more advantages than a middle-class kid. That was why she was still going to public schools, unlike the rest of the children in their neighborhood. Her dad believed she had to study alongside students without her privileges and learn how life was for most people in the country. When Lynn was younger, during primary and middle school, she didn't have any problems with it. But as she grew up and got to know the differences between her lifestyle and the other kids' lives in their neighborhood, she hated it. She had to live in two completely different worlds. In the morning, she was in a school where some of the kids didn't have enough money to buy a new pen, notebook, or bag, while in the afternoon, she was going to private lessons with kids that were trained to show off the wealth of their parents. In the mornings, she felt guilty for her comfortable life, and in the afternoon, she felt insufficient among the rich kids. Lynn couldn't blend in with either of the two groups. She was a stranger to most of them. Lynn always had the best and most expensive clothes and stationery in the public school, making many envy her. And in the private lessons, she couldn't understand or accompany the students when they were bragging about their wealth. She would never forget that day when she was ridiculed for not knowing the name of some clothing brand. Nevertheless, her mom insisted she had to learn how to live in higher societies around the world if she wanted to be part of them one day. Therefore, she arranged the afternoon classes without letting Lynn's dad know about it. He was too busy working and traveling to know Lynn's schedule. That day, Lynn came straight home after school. It was Wednesday, and Lynn knew her mom went to the gym with her friends on even days of the week. So she skipped her private lesson. She had a much better plan for that afternoon. She was going to read the rest of the novel that she had started the night before. The story was so riveting that she had kept reading until 2 a.m. It was getting close to the critical parts, and Lynn could not wait to know the end of the story. When Lynn got home from school, she opened the front door very quietly and checked the living room. The house was completely silent. She released her breath. Her mom wasn't home, otherwise Lynn would hear the talking on the phone or the sound of the TV, or at least music in the house. Her mom was never a quiet person. Lynn smiled. Before going upstairs to her room, she went to the kitchen to make herself a sandwich. Nothing was better than biting into a sandwich while reading a book on her bed. She took the sandwich with her and went upstairs. As soon as she reached the second floor, she heard the sound of someone whimpering in her parents' bedroom. The door was closed and she couldn't see inside the room. She put her bag and sandwich on the floor and slowly walked toward the bedroom door. As she was getting closer, the sound was getting louder. Yes, someone was definitely there. Lynn was scared. She didn't want to admit it, but for that moment, she wished her mom was at home. Finally, she opened the door slowly. Her mom was lying on the floor. Her face was red. "Mom, what happened? Why are you on the floor?" She could barely talk. "I don't know. I woke up sick with a fever just after you left the house for school. I decided to rest in the bed today, but as soon as I got up to get myself something to drink, I fainted. When I woke up, I was on the floor." She had to take deep breaths to finish her sentences. Lynn tried to help her sit up. "You're burning up." "Call an ambulance. We have to go to the hospital. I don't feel good." Lynn called an ambulance. She wanted to call her dad, but what could he do? He was at least a 10-hour flight from home. Lynn wasn't even sure what country he was in right now. So she dismissed the idea. The ambulance came in less than 10 minutes. They asked Lynn and her mom some questions while they took her mom to the ambulance. In the end, one of them gave Lynn a white gown. "Here, wear this and put this mask on." Lynn was confused. "Why do I need this?" "Your mom's disease. It might be infectious. Since this morning, we've had dozens of incidents like this in the area. Everyone that's in contact with these patients needs to protect themselves."